2012, what is it? Thank you all for coming out this evening. These are always special events for me because I lived in Boulder in the late 80s, early 90s. And I see familiar faces out there. And yeah, 2012, it's finally getting on the map. I first got interested in Maya culture back in 1986. I saved up some money and I took a trip south of the border. I'd read about the traditional Maya living in the highlands of Guatemala, and I was fascinated to read that they were still following some of their old traditions and ceremonies. And so, I, as a young man, age 22, saved up some money. I was that guy with the backpack, hitchhiking down to the border, and that first trip was amazing. I really fell in love with Maya culture, and from that point, I tried to return as much as possible. I was really interested in figuring out what this was about and pursuing studies of the Maya cosmology and culture. And I lived and worked with the Maya at different points, kind of doing service work. And over the years, I really became intrigued with this 2012 date. What is it? You could read in the academic literature that this big cycle ending in the Maya calendar, this 13 Baktun period, ends on December 21st of 2012. So for me that was kind of intriguing because that's a solstice date. And that sort of means that, well, maybe there's something intentional built into this date. But if you go out into the academic literature in the late 80s, early 90s, you don't find much. The scholars didn't seem to be really looking at this date in any kind of intriguing way. So everything kind of unfolded from there. And here we are in 2009. The famous date is approaching. And of course, a lot of you are probably familiar with the movie coming out next month. Have you heard about that? The big Roland Emmerich film? Some of you are chuckling there. I think you probably... I had a chance to see an early showing of it, actually, at a press junket that they set up, and I was kind of perplexed that I was chosen to give a presentation for that because my entire rap on this doesn't have anything to do with Doomsday 2012. But it's an interesting question. Why is there this association between this 2012 date and Doomsday? Well... there's a lot of answers to that question, I suppose. I think it's probably easy to say that it's the marketplace, it's showbiz, it's what sells. People are thinking about 2012 as a cycle ending. I talk about it as a cycle ending, but a lot of times the lead off for books and documentaries is always, the Maya predicted the end of the world in 2012. Well, that's just absolutely false. There's no evidence at all in the Maya traditions that they thought about 2012 as a kind of apocalyptic doomsday. So why is this happening? Well, I think it's interesting. Why is the Western culture that we belong to doing this doomsday thing? It's almost like insisting in almost like a pathological way that 2012 is about doomsday. Well, again, it's the marketplace having its way with this date. But I think there's a deeper thing going on in this. And you have to sort of look at what the real message is in the Maya material for 2012, and then we can kind of understand why there's this sort of noise being put up around thinking of it in the way that the people who created the date thought of it. So, maybe a good lead-off into this. It's traditional to do a reading, so I'll start with the first paragraph from my book. 2012, an unstoppable idea. Writing this book was an immense undertaking that had to accommodate new developments in the ever-shifting features of a quickly evolving field. Because of its curious crescendo in our immediate future, and therefore unlike any other topic, 2012ology has been growing exponentially with a unique set of issues and attractions. This accelerating growth of interest in the public arena is driven primarily by urgent doomsday scenarios spun out by the mainstream media and opportunistic writers. And yet the date is not simply a newfangled gadget invented by the marketplace. It is, in fact, a true artifact of the authentic Maya calendar, which has suffered the cut-and-paste cosmologizing of wannabe wizards, pocket protector prophets, and celebrity showmen. This heady stew is all stirred up in the Google cauldron, making a dangerous potion for the unsuspecting newcomer. As you step into this ever-shifting discussion, it will be helpful to have some historical background and a guiding survey of who has been saying what. This is part of what this book offers. So, the 2012 story tells the story of 2012, beginning with its inception over 2,000 years ago in southern Mexico. The early Maya, apparently within the context of this early transitional culture called the Azapan culture, which was transitional between the Olmec and the emerging Maya, developed this calendar. The first dated monuments appear in the 1st century BC, and then it was picked up by the Maya civilization, and you find, during the classic Maya period, you find all these carved monuments with dates in the long count, and the long counts being used to record histories of kings, and as well as mundane local historical events. It's also used to calibrate astronomical cycles like Venus and eclipses. But then in the 10th century AD, when after the classic Maya period collapsed, you don't find any long count monuments carved anymore. It basically fell into disuse. Now there was a short count version of it that survived in Yucatan up basically until the 1700s, but it got fragmented and degraded. So by the time that explorers started to rediscover the temple sites in the jungles of Mexico in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the long count calendar was all but forgotten. Now, it is true that in the highlands of Guatemala today, there are elements of the calendar tradition that survive. The 260-day Tzolk'in calendar is still followed today in the highlands, but the long count was forgotten. So it became the work of scholars to reconstruct how the calendar worked up into the late 1800s. The Dresden Codex, which is one of the few surviving Maya books, was rediscovered. It was found in a library, and it was analyzed, and that really helped people understand how this long count calendar worked. And then scholars figured out how this calendar correlates to our own. That's the great correlation debate that went over many, many decades. And finally figured it out, and that's how we know for sure that this 13 Baktun cycle in this calendar system, the end of the 13 Baktun cycle falls on December 21st of 2012. So